So thanks again for everyone who is in attendance today. I am guessing most of you were in the first session that was last Wednesday. This will be SOLIDWORKS Composer 201, and we're moving into the animation side. So let me get started here. So today we're going to be talking about animated instructions. Last week we had talked about product documentation in a sense of creating high-resolution images after importing our SOLIDWORKS models into Composer, and then taking these high-resolution JPEG images, plugging those into a Word document with a link so that we could go ahead and update our documents easier than normal if there was ever a design change or some sort of ECO or ECN. Next Wednesday will be the last of the 3 sessions. And this one I have called Customer Experience. And the reason I call it Customer Experience is we will be talking about how to create content from Composer that is interactive for our end users, our customers, or even our in-house training, things like that. So that'll be an introduction to links and events, and then how to connect our views with our animations. But today we're going to jump on with animations. We're going to create an instruction with the same SOLIDWORKS model everyone saw last week. We used the RC helicopter model. I'm going to use the same thing today, and we'll look at how to replace the cockpit part. So we'll go through and create this animation, and I already went through and created it, and we'll take a look at it now. This is exactly what we'll be creating. So we're going to talk about translating components, changing properties, adding notes, changing material appearances, and then adding graphics. So it's pretty short and sweet, but it's going to cover a lot of the real basics of animation and how to create those. Okay, so let's talk about what Composer is when it comes to animation. We talk about animations in Composer as being keyframe based. What this means on a more simplistic level is we're arranging our components or our actors, our graphics, our cameras, and then we're just taking a snapshot of that in a moment of time. And when I get into it, we'll take a look at the timeline. And basically what we're doing is we're creating a key. So component will be at 1 second. The component will be at place A at 1 second, and then at 2 seconds it'll be at place B. That's all we're really saving in our Composer file. And when we go to animate and play the sequence, Composer does all the actual animation. We don't actually have to do anything. We just say where a component's going to be at time 0 and time 1, and it translates the component from point A to point B. This right here is kind of my recommended best practice for creating an animation in Composer. Basically, we're going to start with our model on the screen. We're going to go ahead and create all of our geometry transitions. So, if we're going through and creating a disassembly process, I'm going to start by taking components off, and I'm going to be saving those locations of the components throughout this timeline. Once I've finished creating all of these transitions with my geometry, that's when I'll go in and I'll start adding graphics, labels, annotations, call-outs, balloons, things like that. And then once those have been added, that's when I'll go through and place camera. So when we start, maybe we're zoomed out as the show begins. We zoom in, and then we rotate around the model to the next sequence of geometry transitions. So that's what I'm talking about when I have cameras here. And then the very last thing will be time management. So when you see the timeline here in a minute, or for those of you that are already using Composer, time management is important, and I think it is really kind of the last sequence of putting this animation together. We'll go in, play it. If something, if some components move a little too fast, we'll slow them down. If there's a big gap of time where nothing's happening, we'll shorten it. That's what I'm talking about when I'm speaking of time management. But again, this is my recommended best practice. Some people create their animations differently. Maybe they find it more effective going through, every 10 seconds and creating everything right from the beginning, which is totally fine. This is just something I recommend. But let's jump into Composer. This is the helicopter model that we used last week. It's the same thing we'll be using today. The very first thing I want to do is create a default view, which you've noticed I already have created. And I talked a little bit about this last week. Creating a default view is a good way to revert back to its just neutral settings where it was when it was imported. It's just a good view to have available. But I want to create another view, and in this other view, I'm going to add some text boxes. So I'm going to come up to my Author tab, add some text, and I'm going to call this Maintenance Procedures. So this, right now you're probably wondering why I'm creating a view, because I thought we were talking about animation, but the reason is because I'm going to take this view that I'm creating now and make this my starting point for my animation. Maintenance Procedures. I like that, and I'm going to actually apply a style I created to this. So the style I've added to this, I've called my title panel. It basically came in here and changed a bunch of my properties for this, this actual label. The only other thing I want to point out that I don't think I had incorporated with my style was this background property. If I enable this, now when I move my model, it actually covers up and puts that label in the background, which I think is nice during animation. So I'm going to leave that in the background. And I'm going to go ahead and save this view. I'm going to call this Start. Actually, I'm going to add one more little block here, and I'm going to call this Rev 001-A. I'll leave that kind of right there. I could use a magnetic line to line these up, but I'm going to leave it as is. If you've also noticed, I've changed my paper space to kind of a 16:9 ratio, just to make it a little larger. And that's something that you can do in the properties, under document properties here, under paper space. So I've saved my view. Now I want to move into animation. Last week we didn't even touch animation. Some people were maybe like, well, I don't even see the animation tab up here. It's actually not going to be available until you turn the animation on. Right now in this Show Hide menu, I can turn on the animation. It moves into animation mode. I have this little icon here to go back into view mode if I'd like, but we're going to be in animation mode basically the rest of the day, or the rest of the hour, not the rest of the day. Also, once I've turned on the animation tab, I have a tab for animations up here. Also, you notice my timeline has popped up, and this is what actually controls what we're creating here. So by default, I have kind of this blue gradient background. Nothing has been recorded in my timeline. So all I'm going to basically do to start my animation is just take this start view that I created and drop this at 0 seconds. And now it changes my background because of the properties I captured in that view. The only thing it doesn't bring in, and it hides by default, is our panels. So I just need to go ahead and just turn those back on. So this is the beginning of our animation. We've created our starting point. Also, the name of the view becomes a marker. And we can add markers kind of anywhere along here. Oops, don't need those. We can add markers anywhere along here. And the reason we add markers is because between those markers, that is a specific animation sequence. And in the future, which we'll talk about next week, we can create interactive content where if you click on a component, you can have it play a certain segment of animation, and it will play between those two markers. So we have one already created here. We're not going to end up creating another one. That one just comes in with the view. But let's start and get into this animation. So basically, I still have my 3D model here. What I've recorded so far, you'll notice two keys over here. The top one here is recording the environment properties, the component locations. The bottom key here looks like a camera. That's actually where we are starting our, that's the camera that we saved in our view. I have this option here to play camera mode. If I turn this on, it actually moves us to the view that this camera had saved, or moves us to the orientation that this camera saved. And now if you see, like as I move forward, anytime I move my model and I move my time bar, it snaps back to where that location is for this camera. So we're going to start by just creating the transitions with our geometry, and then once we have done that, we'll go back in and we'll add our graphics labels. After that, at the very end, we'll add our cameras, and then we'll go through and we'll just make sure that our animation looks good and it's moving in a timely manner. If we need to, we'll work with the time management and move these keys that we create. So by default, generally when we start an animation, we have something called auto keys here. Auto key mode is going to place keys automatically. And just to kind of demonstrate that, I'm going to leave this time bar at 2 seconds, and I'm going to go ahead and grab this landing gear, and I'm going to translate it. So keep in mind, this key at the beginning here stores the location of this landing gear at 0 seconds. I've moved my time bar to 2 seconds, and all I have to do is decide its new location, and because I have auto keys on, it creates a key for me. And now if I go back to the beginning and play, it just moves from point A to point B in the time that I've specified. That is the basic concept in SOLIDWORKS Composer. We're just saying where something is going to be at point A and where it'll be at time A and time B. So it works the same way with properties. So let me kind of demonstrate this. So if I move in on this, I'm going to move my time bar a little farther ahead. I'm going to turn off my camera mode so we can actually see my item down here. Here at 2.5 seconds, I want to make sure that the opacity of this character is at its full 100% or 255. So I'm going to use this here to set a property key. And this is recording that it's fully opaque at 2.5 seconds. I'm going to move my time bar ahead to 3 seconds, and I'm going to take this property of opacity and change it to 0. And because I have auto keys on, it creates a key for me of that change. So between 2.5 and 3 seconds, it's going to move from 100% opaque to 100% invisible. So if I kind of play this out from here, just move my time bar by clicking, I'll go ahead and play. And if you saw that, I'll play that one more time. So it's still translating downward at the beginning. And then we lose its opacity. Opacity moves down to 0. So just a quick rundown of what the keys really do. They just store information about specific properties, locations, orientation, things like that. That's all these keys are doing. SOLIDWORKS Composer does all the work that's in between the keys. I'm going to actually delete these keys, and it's the same bounding box up here as it is down here. I'm going to grab all those keys and just hit my delete key. And I'll move back to the beginning. First thing I want to do now is at 1 second, I want to record the location. I want to make sure these screws are at this location until 1 second. So I'm going to grab these 2 screws, and I'm going to, instead of using auto keys, and this will be something that's up to you as an individual. I personally don't like using auto keys. Sometimes I like to kind of conceptualize what my next step is, my animation, and if I move something, it creates a key, and sometimes I forget that a key was made, and I go through and play my animation, and things are kind of out of sequence. So I'm going to turn this off. When you turn that off, it's just 1 extra click. So the first click, I've moved to 1 second. I have my components highlighted. I'm going to store the location at 1 second. I'm going to move my time bar out to 2 seconds. And then using my cylindrical explode tool, I'm going to explode these outward to about there. And I'm going to store that new location at 2 seconds. So now I'll come back to the beginning of my animation. You see here, my screws stay in place for the first second, and then from 1 second to 2 seconds, they explode outward. So don't be afraid to use these explode tools when you're creating animations. They become very useful, and it ends up being very easy to create animations of explode sequences. So now that I've created the explode with the screws, I want to set a property to make these screws invisible. So another thing we can do with this time bar is just move it along, and we can watch our animation from frame by frame. So once it comes out here, they stop, and then at 2.5 seconds, I'm going to highlight these screws again. Oops. I'm going to turn off my transformation tools, and I'm going to come to their opacity. I'm going to highlight it over here because that's what I want to record, and I'm going to go ahead and click on my set key for properties. So this key here is setting a key for a property. The one next to it is setting a location key. The one next to that is for cameras. We'll get into this one a little later on. But I've set a key now for the opacity of these to maintain that 255 up until 2.5 seconds, and I want them to disappear by 3 seconds. So I'm going to turn this to 0, and then go ahead and set that key again. Now if I click in the graphics area so nothing is highlighted, play my sequence, screws come out, and they disappear, which looks good to me. Now, a lot of people may be wondering, well, what happens when I want to bring those screws back in, but I can't select them on the screen because they're invisible? We have a couple different options. One thing we can do is come to the Assembly tab, and we could come through here and we could try and find the 2 screws that we've changed opacity. Another thing we can do is we can come back to when they were opaque, and we can select them here, and then we can move our time bar to where we want. And you notice we still have them highlighted, they're just not visible at the moment. But something I like to do, keeping these highlighted, I like to use this option here, create a selection set. So I know I'm going to be selecting these 2 screws again in the future. If I click on this towards the bottom of my assembly tree, and now can call these, I can just call them screws animation. So now I know that these are the screws that I animated with, and they're kind of in a folder here, or they're kind of nested. And now if I ever need to select these 2 screws again, so if I get to a point where they're invisible, I can just select here, select both screws. And you can put you can create as many selection sets as you want. I've never reached a limit. There may be a limit, but I've never reached it. So just make sure if you start creating selection sets, you name them something you can remember. But anyways, we'll come back to that a little later on. I just wanted to create the selection set now so I can access it later on. So another thing I want to point out, you'll notice that we created, we kind of changed a property to make these screws invisible. But if you look in the tree here, let's highlight these screws. These are the 2 screws that we changed properties for and made invisible. but you'll notice right next to them their checkmark box for being hidden or shown is still checkmarked. So this is important in animation. Everything, if you need something to become invisible or lose its opacity to a certain extent, you have to do it in the Properties Manager here. You can't just come up and uncheck mark the box and record, because it won't record that. And if that screw is used anywhere else in the animation, it will not be shown. So make sure in animations, whenever you want something to disappear, you use the property opacity versus coming up here and unchecking these boxes. So the next step here, actually before I move on, we created two keys here to show this property opacity kind of being removed. If you watch this opacity here, if I move through these two, you see it actually shows you its different stages per frame. Another way of doing this, if I just delete this real quick, another way of doing this, and SOLIDWORKS makes this very easy. I'm going to move my time bar back to 3 seconds because this is where I know I want my screws to be invisible. This is that exact frame I want them to be invisible. We have something called effects. And if I open this up, we have fade in and fade out. So right now, because they're opaque, I want them to be invisible at 3 seconds. I'm going to go ahead and fade out. And you'll notice what it does is it creates two keys here, and it basically did exactly what we did. The only thing is that it's a specific time that they create this transition from. If I ever need to now, I can just move this back to 2.5 seconds. And now if we watch this whole sequence again, translate out and disappear. So it does the exact same thing that we did. We just created each key frame, or excuse me, each key individually. So moving on, I'm going to move my time bar now up to about 3.5 seconds. And I want to now remove this cockpit from the main body. So I'm going to do that by just kind of orienting my screen, however it's easiest for me at the beginning. And I know that I'm going to be moving this cockpit. I also need to move this LED along with it. So I'm going to grab the LED as well. And now from here, I want to set a location because I want these to stay in place from 0 to 3.5 seconds. And now if I move forward here to about 4 seconds, and I use my right-click flyout menu, I'm going to pull this out just a little bit here. I'm going to actually go ahead and record that new location. So between 3.5 and 4 seconds, it'll move out. However, I moved it out. I guess I didn't notice. And then from here, I can go ahead and if I wanted to, I could move this to another location. So I'll come out even farther. Maybe I'll come down a little bit. And then I also, at the same time, want to rotate. So I'm going to rotate this down a little bit. And this new location it's at right now, I have to highlight those, and I'll save that location. So let's go back and look at this sequence. I've saved 3 location keys. At 3.5 seconds, it's where it is right now. Between 3.5 and 4 seconds, it will translate out along the, I think, that'll be the x-axis. And then from 4 seconds to 4.5, it'll not only move out, but downward, and it will rotate. So let's go ahead and play this out. And it kind of opens up like that. And you can kind of get a feel of what's going on here. We created our location at time A, our location at time B, and Composer did all the work, all the rest of the work in between. So you'll notice from 3.5, it only moves in that linear fashion. Also, when we click on a component after we've moved it, you'll notice these red lines here. This is the actual animation path that it's moving along. So to kind of show you that, oops, I zoomed way in here. Let's bring this down. Scroll wheel is just going to zoom in and out on your timeline. You can also hold it down and pan. And then if you double click, it actually makes your timeline from start to finish. So however long your timeline is, it'll kind of fit the timeline to the screen. But I like to look at basically every 3.5 seconds. So anyways, I'm going to come back here, and you can see it's following that animation path. That line is actually located on the component's origin. And then from here, at this point, if I wanted to, I could actually move these lines. So although I saved a location, which is this dot right here, I can still move those locations as I see fit. I also, with this highlighted, can come into the properties, and if I come down to animation, under path, I could go ahead and choose custom, which will put in spline points that I can move and add curvature to. So if I left it like this, we could watch I guess I'd have to save that as a property. I could go through and save that as a property, and then it would, this one adds a little smoothness to it. I'm actually just going to leave this as is, but I just wanted to point that out. It's easy to manipulate these paths once they've been created with these keys. So let's take a look at our animation from the start. I'm going to go ahead and play here. And I always recommend going through and checking out your animation as you create it when it comes to sequencing and everything. You just want to make sure you're not forgetting any steps, and this is a good way of helping you remember. So I have exploded this out, and I want to do the same thing as the screws, because I'm going to be replacing this cockpit with a new component. I would want to simulate this, kind of just being pulled off and thrown in the garbage or whatever. Maybe it's cracked. My kid threw it on the ground, which is pretty typical of these helicopters. So what we want to do is we're going to actually want to change the appearance of this one here. I don't actually have two different cockpit components in my SolidWorks model that I imported. So what I need to do in Composer is change its appearance. And if I highlight this and we look at this component's properties, we actually have the option to change appearance under Environment Effect. So under Type, I have all of these different options. I could come in here and change this to gold. And you see this nice reflection. I could change this to satin. I mean, just to kind of simulate some of the appearances here. Ours specifically, I want this to change. I'm going to move to 5 seconds here. So I have my component selected and moving to 5 seconds. And I want to change, because my kid threw this on the ground and broke my first one, I went to the store and I bought the aluminum cockpit so that it couldn't be broken again. So I've changed this property. I want to record this at 5 seconds. So I'm going to go ahead and hit record. And now if you look here, and this is specific to this property, to the material appearance, that you only need to set one property key. It will maintain the kind of this green flashy graphic appearance right up until that key that you change the appearance. So this is one of the very few properties that only require one key. Most other properties require two keys so it can transition from that, property 1 to property 2, or so on and so forth. So now I have changed to my new cockpit material, or I've grabbed my new component, but I don't want my users to see it just change like this, because that'll look kind of cheesy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this forward, and here at 5 seconds, actually maybe a little bit after that, at this location here, I'm going to go ahead and grab these two components, and I'm going to fade out. You'll notice here it created two keys, and what it did, if I move back here, and I move through, it has changed its opacity from 100% to 0%, and now while it's invisible, the material of this component changes, and I'm going to move up to 6 seconds. Actually, I'm going to have to select these again, so I'm going to grab them first. So I'm going to move up to 6 seconds here, and now I'm going to fade back in. Now let's come back here. Let's make sure our sequence works properly, so it's invisible. Property changes, turns back on. We have our aluminum, our new component being shown. So I'm going to go back to the beginning here. Let's go ahead and look and see how we're doing. Screws come out, disappear, front end comes off, disappears, back on. Perfect. So now all we need to do is basically just reattach the things we've already done. And because we have these paths already created, we can just reuse them. So in Composer, it's very, very easy, to take something apart, as you saw, but now it's even easier to put it back together. So let's move our timeline along. I'm going to come up here to about 6.5 seconds. And I want to take a look at these two components and their specific paths, because I'm going to copy them and just move them to this position down here. So we have something in animation. These are our filters. And these filter the keys that we create in our timeline. So this one will show keys for selected actors only. I have my cockpit and my LED light selected. I'm going to click on that, and now you see some of our keys disappear, and it only shows us keys relating to these two components. And now what I want is I want to reuse their transition path. So that is just going to be a location key. I'm not worried about the properties I changed. I don't want to change those back. So I'm going to use this filter here to show location keys only. And now we can see here, these are the location keys for those two components. I move back here. Everything else still changes, but we're only seeing the keys for the path this took outward. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to select all three keys, hold down my control key, and drag new copies out to 6.5 seconds. And you're probably thinking right now, well, at 3.5 seconds we had its location on the body, by 4.5 it was out here. And you are correct. All we need to do is flip these around. So if I right-click on these while they're selected, I can invert this time selection. And now when I invert that, let's turn these filters off. Let's play this sequence from the beginning, or from here. Comes out, disappear, material, comes back on, and just moves backwards through the sequence. So we're going to do the exact same thing with the screws. We're also going to be copying those keys for the property change. So let's grab our selection set from our assembly tree, the two screws here, and let's filter for just their keys specifically. And now let's come back and make sure we're looking at the correct thing here. So these two keys right here, and it's probably kind of hard to tell through this webcast, but this is where their opacity is changing. If you look in their property manager over here, you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Between 1 second and 2 seconds is when they actually explode. So I'm going to actually use all of these. I'm going to move down my timeline a little bit, maybe zoom out so it's easier here. I'm going to go ahead and copy and drag all of these down here. And just do the exact same thing before. I'm going to invert that time selection. And now if we play our sequence here, I'll turn all my keys back on. We'll watch our sequence. So copied and inverted the time selection for both the opacity change that we made and the transition of the geometry that we made. So from the very beginning, we have basically gone through and created all of the geometry transitions that we needed to. We've gone through and changed some material and some opacity appearances. I guess I would say that's pretty important, and I would do that during the first stage. If I click in here, I would do that as well in this first stage of creating animation. I would do this during the geometry time here. So Let's see where we are here. So the very last thing I want to do, let's play this one more time. I want to make sure everything's good. You know, one thing I notice here, when my screws come out, maybe they come out and kind of catch the user off guard because it's sitting doing nothing for the first second. So I want to get my user's attention, and I want to change the opacity of this cockpit before these translate outwards. So maybe at half a second here, I'm going to grab my cockpit. It's going to be at 255. I want to maintain that from 0 seconds to a half a second. So I'm going to go ahead and record that property. And maybe at, you know, between half a second and 1 second, I'm going to go ahead and change its opacity down to 40. And I'm going to record that. So now what's happening here, my animation starts, my cockpit becomes semi-transparent, and then my screws are translated outward. So I like that. I like that sequence a little more. So the only other thing I need to do, if you notice, here I've saved the opacity property at 40, and let's watch this. Watch it just creep up. The opacity creeps up, keeps going, keeps going, keeps going, all the way up to this point that we last saved its opacity at 255. So I need to make sure, because this animation will look kind of goofy if I leave this playing, and it just kind of comes back to 100% and then disappears. So we need to make sure that that's not a problem. So all we need to do is basically take this one at 255 and this one here, and we need to find a place to copy it. So I want to go ahead and probably do it right in here. So I'm going to go ahead and grab these two keys. I'm going to copy these to here, and then I'm just going to invert them. So now if we watch this sequence, we go semi-transparent, and because we created another key over here that maintains that 40 transparency, it maintains between those two times, and then comes back to fully opaque, and then continues on with the animation for the rest of it. So just changing an opacity of the cockpit at the beginning for the screw removal. Let's play this whole sequence. It's pretty good so far. Obviously, it's kind of coming off of our screen. So the next stage is probably going to be creating some cameras. So I'm going to turn camera mode back on, and I'm going to revert back to the beginning. This is where my camera starts. And when this starts to change opacity, maybe I want to zoom in on that beforehand. So I'm going to come before that, and I'm going to kind of zoom in on this cockpit area. I'm going to find a good angle that I like, maybe something like this. That looks good. And I'm going to actually just record that location. So from the beginning now, I'm just zooming in from our first camera right up until this point. Now I always recommend at the beginning of an animation to have a good like second or two where nothing is happening, where the camera's staying in place. You know, the second someone opens up this animation and it's immediately moving, they're going to be lost from the beginning. So I need to record this. I need to change this camera, or excuse me, maintain its location. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that key, pull this out a little bit. I don't need this marker here. And then I'm going to do something that I talk about doing at the end of design, but I'm going to use my time management. I'm going to actually push all of my keys back to 1 second here. So whenever we put, whenever we do this bounding box here, we have this little arrow above, and that is for scaling, or excuse me, not scaling, just moving all keys behind or in front. So if I had selected a larger area like this, I could actually shorten and bring all my keys forward. But I want to leave these where they are, so I'm going to move those out. So from here now, from 0 seconds, if I go back to the beginning, I maintain my camera angle, and then from here to here, it zooms into my cockpit. I know I'm going to have to add some space here, so let's just move that back there. Okay, so my camera angle comes in here, transparent, screws, explode, my cockpit becomes opaque again, and now we know this sequence next, the cockpit's going to be coming off, which is fine. Change that. This goes back on. I'm going to pan my timeline down. Screws come back in. Perfect. So up until probably 11.5 seconds, I want to maintain this exact camera orientation that I'm in. So I'm just going to go ahead and save another camera key so that between 11.5, I move this down, and 1.5, I maintain the same camera orientation. And then from 11.5 maybe out to 12, I want to zoom back out and just orient my new helicopter right in the middle of the screen. Just like that. Then I'll probably do the same thing at the end of my animation. I want to make sure it just maintains a camera angle for at least a half a second. So let's go back to the beginning and watch this. We zoom in. All of our geometry happens. Come back out, and I'm here. The very last thing I want to do is add some graphics. And I'm just realizing now that I am not following along with my best practices. But that's okay. You see, everyone does something different, so I don't even follow my own. Last thing I want to do is I just want to create some space here because I want to put some arrows pointing inward on my screws, kind of letting my users know that these screws need to be put back into our helicopter. So I'm going to go ahead and turn camera mode off because I'm going to need to zoom in and add some graphics. I'm going to turn that off here. And then on these two screws, I'm going to go ahead. Keep in mind I've put my time bar where I want my arrow actors to become visible. And by default, Composer will put 2 keys in. So put my arrows on. I've used the Alt key to snap to the geometry. And you notice where I had my time bar, it's where they become fully opaque. And at this time, Composer automatically put in a key to maintain their 0, to keep them invisible from the beginning. It would be annoying if we were dragging in graphics and they were just visible this entire time, and I had to go back to 0 seconds every time and create a 0%, opacity key at the beginning. So see here in this sequence, they become opaque, and then the screws are pushed in. And because of their length, of these arrows, they actually move with our geometry, which is always really cool. So I just need to make sure that these arrows, if I select them, I'm going to have to make these invisible again. So I'm going to go ahead and select here. I have my arrows selected. Once the screws are put in, I'm going to go ahead maybe just a little bit after that, and I'm going to use my fade out effect. And now you'll see the screws will come in and my arrows will disappear. I'm going to start from the beginning, leave my camera mode on, go ahead and play. Everything's looking pretty good to me. There we go. Finished. And I'm at about 12.5 seconds. Sometimes maybe we want to just slow this entire animation down a little bit. I'm going to select everything, and I'm going to zoom out a little bit here so we can see the timeline. And I'm just going to scale this. So now that I have everything selected here, I can grab this little arrow and I can scale everything outward. to 15. So the scaling only works when we have this bounding box around all of our keys. So if I deselect, you saw me do this before, but I had nothing selected here. This moves everything behind it. If I select specific keys, it'll actually scale those keys and then move everything else behind it in a linear fashion. So I don't actually want to scale these. So I'm going to make sure those are back in place. And I think our animation is pretty much complete. So only one last thing I want to do here is I just want to put in some instructions. So I'm going to come back to the beginning here. As this moves in, before these screws are translated outward, maybe at about here when this camera stops moving in, I want a text image to show up. So I'm going to go ahead and click text here, and using this property text string, notice it created 2 keys for this already. I don't even have any properties created here for what it's actually going to be saying. But I want this to say, let's go ahead and type in instructions. And number 1 will be remove screws. So because I changed the text string here, I need to actually record that property. So I'm going to go ahead and create a key there for that property. I also have the option to make this a neutral property, which means it will always treat that text string as a neutral property. So I'm going to go ahead and create that. Now when this comes in, it already has that text there. So as this moves through, my screws come out, they disappear. And now somewhere in here, probably at 5 seconds, I want to add to this instruction list. So I'm going to go ahead here, and I'm going to type in number 2, and this will be exchange component. And with this property selected, I want to record this new change. This is just like the materials property. At this specific point, that will be added to my instruction list. So once that component has been exchanged, and before these screws go in, maybe at about here, I'm going to go ahead and add a 3rd instruction. I'm going to say tighten screws. I know we're getting close to the end, you guys. I'm almost done here, I promise. So at this point, I need to save that change I just made. So I'm going to record that new line of text. So now we see as we move through our animation, the text is added and removed. And with that whole box selected here, I'll actually have that maintained to the end. So that if, someone is watching my video, they can watch, and then the instructions will maintain till the end. So when it stops, it's still visible. So now that I've created my animation, I just need to come to my workshops. And last session, we looked at high resolution image. This time around, we're just going to go to the video workshop. This one's pretty straightforward. We have anti-aliasing. This will go through each individual frame and smooth out all of our edges. I recommend this if you're looking for something very, very nice looking. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that on. And then AVI output, if I wanted to change the resolution of my screen, right now it's set to the size of my paper. I could go ahead and change that here. I can also pick the range that I want to save out. So if I have a very long, maybe I have a 30-minute animation, I can go ahead and pick, selection, whatever I have selected down here, or I can specify in seconds, from 10 seconds to the end. We can go ahead and do that there. But I'm going to leave these on all, and I'm going to go ahead and save this video to my desktop, and we'll call this, and we'll just leave it as is. I'll go ahead and save. It's going to ask about compression. You'll have to go ahead and choose what's best for you, and then we'll let this go through and it creates every frame individually. You can kind of see that happening here. It's also using the anti-aliasing at every frame to make nice smooth edges. So it's giving us a high resolution video, which is always really nice. So maybe while this is being done, I'll go ahead and look at some questions. Let's start at the top here. This session has been recorded. Oh, we'll go ahead and look at this animation. Might look a little choppy through the webinar, but there's my animation. It's complete. Let's play it one more time so we can see it. You know, and this, if this was my, my product, I could go ahead and save this animation on a CD, have it on my website. Have my customers be able to come onto my website and take a look if they need to change something. Obviously, that's pretty basic. Most people, especially engineers, should know how to exchange that cockpit. But it's just Composer's really given us an easy way to communicate with our customers, with people internally in our companies, maybe in our in manufacturing. Hey, here's an animation. This is how you put these components together. It can be used for end users or customers, which is always really a neat tool. And then, we'll go one step further next week, and we'll jump into the interactivity, so we can link between animation and views. So I'm going to jump back into the slide here. We'll move forward. So next week will be the customer experience. This is the link for registering for that next session. And these two sessions I've done a pretty bad job at time management. So I will do my best next week. I know, again, you guys are busy, so I will try to get to these questions. We also save these questions. If I don't get to your question, if I have an email address for you, I'll go ahead and email you my answer, or someone will within the organization. But if you do want to stay on the line here, excuse me, for about another 15 minutes, I'll try to go through as many of these questions as possible. So for anyone who needs to leave the session, I just want to thank you for your time today. If you have any additional questions about Composer, please feel free to give me a call or email, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So, okay, let's jump into these questions. This was recorded, so we will have a link in about a week, and I'll go ahead and send that link or make that available during the next session. I'll put that up on the screen. Also, if you want a link directly sent to you, go ahead and email me, and I can get that out to you as soon as the link has been created. And basically, we take these recordings and then we put them on our YouTube site. Once I have that link, I'll send it to you. Also, for last week, if anyone was looking to see that, that should be up here probably sometime today or tomorrow. And I do have a list of people who emailed me the first week. I'll get back to you about that link. But can you animate more than one position, such as overall dimensions, cut sections? Yes. In Composer, we have the ability to create section views, and we can animate that. So we could have a section plane start outside of our model, not cutting anything, and then animate its position from outside of the model to wherever we want our section view to show. So we have the ability to animate cut sections or cuts in general. Dimensions, we do have the ability to animate dimensions as well. So if we have a component that is moving in our animation and we have a dimension attached to it, the dimension will actually change with the height or movement of that component that it's dimensioning to and from. So, good question. let's see here. Missing some of the, okay, so the file type from these animations is an AVI. We do have the option to, if I go back into, or let me just talk about that. We do have the option to use the high resolution image workshop, and we can create views of every frame. So we can create images like JPEG images or whatever type of images you're looking for of every frame, and then you can use knitting tools to knit those images together to create, really nice animations as well. Or you can pull it into some sort of video editing software and go ahead and change there. But directly from the video workshop in Composer, you're going to be publishing as an AVI file. Are there tutorials available to learn Composer? Yes, you can find tutorials on, there's a couple websites. There is Composer Forum, and there are some tutorials on there. There's also a website called 3D Mojo, M-O-J-O, 3dmojo.com, and that will have some tutorials. Also YouTube, some people post tutorials on there. If you're looking to learn, we definitely have classes available. We have a 3-day course to learn Composer, and it goes from point A to point B with Composer. Or point A to point Z. You learn everything there is to know about Composer in the 3 days. So if that's something you're interested in, contact me and let me know, and I can get you some information on that. Where does it get all of its materials property? Does it grab all the ones available in SolidWorks? No, it does not. It actually, when Composer is installed, there is a path location to a folder that has JPEG images of these material appearances, and that's something I forgot to mention, which is fantastic in Composer. We can actually use all those same materials in SolidWorks, but you would need to copy those images to the Composer location. So Composer looks in a specific folder for those images, for the material appearances, and if you can go ahead and you can even create your own appearances, and you can just save your images to that folder, and they'll be available in that drop down. So, what players can be used to watch the animations? This AVI, I think, was playing in Windows Media Player on my computer, but you can also watch this animation if you open it up in Composer Player. I guess it's an AVI file, so wherever AVIs are able to play, that's where you should be able to watch the animation. So it should work in most players. File type is AVI. What is the best codec to get the smoothest video? I would say TechSmith codec. That's the one we recommend to most everyone. We recommend that for not only Composer, but also SolidWorks. It's one of the best I've used. So that will probably produce one of the smoothest videos, and it does a good job at compression. Questionnaire screen takes too much time. Missed the end of the video. Okay, so maybe we won't do polls next time around. Sounds like the screen's getting in the way. So my apologies. I will avoid using these polls next time. So is there a difference creating an animation in Composer and creating it directly in SolidWorks? They do similar things. It's definitely something to take a look at. You can do animation in SolidWorks. It's a little more, I'd say a little more time consuming in SolidWorks because you generally, depending on the type of animation you're creating, it can take a little more time. You're not able to add graphics as easily as you are in Composer. So there's pros and cons to both Composer and using SolidWorks. But we do have a video, I think, on our YouTube site comparing and showing you the differences between Composer animation and SolidWorks animation. So, if you want to take a look at that, you can go ahead and find that. We have a link to our YouTube site at goengineer.com, so go ahead and take a look at that. That's actually a great question. But I would say overall, if you're making work instructions and you want to make the communication as clear as possible, using graphics and being able to add text so easily in Composer, I think is what really makes Composer animation a little more user-friendly, a little less time-consuming. Okay, that's all the questions I have here. If I missed your question, my apologies. Go ahead and, or I'll see it when it's printed out and I'll try to get back to you. Otherwise, you can email me with any other additional questions. Thank you guys so much for your time today, and I look forward to seeing you all again next week on Wednesday. Thank you.